Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Zara.
I'm Nandini.
Today, Nandini is back on the pod to talk us through the government's new plan to crack down on the aviation industry.
Yesterday, the government handed down its vision for Australia's aviation sector. Basically, it's saying it's going to boost consumer rights, increase competition, support regional aviation, and help the sector become more environmentally friendly. But the opposition has called the report a, quote, missed opportunity and accused the government of mishandling what it's called an aviation crisis. So what does the government want to change, and what will it actually take to overhaul the sector?
Now, Nandini, it's felt like a pretty long run of bad news after bad news after bad news for the aviation sector. But now the government is saying it actually has a plan to fix the industry, to fix all of the issues that have come since COVID and flight cancellations and delays and everything else. What do we need to know about this new plan to fix flying in Australia?
So Australia's domestic aviation industry has faced increasing scrutiny over the last couple of years for a number of reasons, some of which you just touched on. But in an effort to turn this around, the government has released this new document. It's called the Aviation White Paper, and it's basically considered the most, quote, significant overhaul of aviation for more than a decade.
I want to get into that because it's quite the hooky headline. But before we do, what actually is a white paper? Because we're going to speak about this a fair bit on today's podcast.
So a white paper is a way of saying a government document. But
why can't they just call it a government document?
The difference is that it's a specific topic or issue. So it could be foreign policy or defence, or in this case, aviation. Think of it as like a really in-depth report. Like really in-depth. I just read it.
How many pages was it?
Like over 200.
Okay, noted.
That sets out ideas and frameworks to basically inform future legislation and policy. So a bunch of recommendations. And a white paper is presented to Parliament for a discussion, usually before or alongside a new bill being tabled.
Okay, so the white paper essentially gives us an idea of how the government's planning to change the sector. And in this case, we're talking about aviation. Can you just talk me through what were the biggest concerns? Like, why did this white paper come about, and what are kind of the answers to these issues?
So the white paper lays out 56 policy initiatives, and it covers 10 different areas. It's a lot. We're not going to go into all of it right now, obviously. But I thought it would be important to start with something that impacts us all, and that's consumer rights. And think about, all our missed flights.
Yeah.
This is what we're talking about.
There are many.
Yeah. The white paper recommended a new consumer rights charter and the implementation of an independent body that would regulate and monitor the entire industry. They're calling this the Aviation Industry Ombuds Scheme.
Okay, not the clickiest name. They fell down on that one.
Chunky boy.
But can we start with the rights charter? What would that look like in particular?
So the charter would set out obligations or requirements for airlines around the fair and appropriate treatment of customers, is what they're calling it. And it's a minimum level of customer service. Bare minimum kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I'm sure many of us, like I said, have faced last-minute flight cancellations and rescheduled flights. Basically, this charter would include customer entitlements to refunds for cancelled flights, but also for disrupted and unreasonably delayed services.
That's a pretty major idea.
Yeah. And the white paper says that airlines would have to then also report the reason for why a flight is cancelled or rescheduled. And this is the big thing, because they can't just say that a flight has been cancelled or rescheduled. They actually need to provide you with a reason for cancelling it, and also certainty of either a rescheduled flight or that you're going to be refunded. The charter would also determine things like how long a reasonable flight delay would be, or how long should you have to wait for a refund, and other requirements around transparency, communication, and customer support.
I mean, the thing that I think about, though, when we talk, like, that sounds amazing. For me to, as a consumer, have a flight cancelled and then to be entitled to a refund or at least an explanation sounds great. But what is to say that the airlines won't just ignore this charter? Like, is there any enforcement mechanism here?
So this is where the Aviation Ombudsman comes in, and they would be appointed to deal with breaches and monitor misconduct within the industry. And it could also be referred to the ACCC, that's the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. The Ombudsman would be given powers to take action against airports and airlines if they breach those obligations, and would also publish regular reports on industry performance and how they're tracking.
And I mean, when you're talking about this, I'm thinking about how as recently as last week, we heard news that Jetstar is facing a class action over failing to refund cancelled COVID flights, and Qantas is also facing similar legal action. So is the idea that this rights charter and the ombudsman that you've just been speaking about, is the idea that they then deal with those disputes before they escalate to the courts?
That's the idea, if it's legislated.
Okay.
Those cases would hypothetically be resolved a lot earlier, and that's because we'd have this sort of definitive policy document that details the obligations that airlines need to follow and what they need to do for customers.
Okay, understood. And so if we move away from that idea for a second, what else did the white paper cover?
Another important thing that came across is accessibility for passengers, especially passengers that are travelling with a disability. In Australia, it is unlawful to deny someone access to services like transport in this case because of a disability. And so the recent Disability Royal Commission found a number of accessibility issues in airports and with airlines, particularly for people who might need wheelchair accessibility or even the accessibility of bathrooms on planes. So the government said that it wants to introduce aviation industry specific disability standards that could improve air travel for all Australians.
I'm sure that would be a very welcome step and something that's so important, but perhaps doesn't get the attention that it needs. So it'll be really interesting to understand where that goes. While we've been talking, I've been thinking about all of the news headlines that we've spoken about a number of times on this podcast. One of them has been, this cancelled flight idea, but the other has been competition and how bloody difficult it is for anyone that's not Virgin or Qantas to actually keep an airline afloat in Australia. Is there anything about competition, especially in light of what's happened to Rex recently?
Well, yeah, exactly. Passengers, we've been left with one of two choices when it comes to domestic travel, Virgin and Qantas, which also owns Jetstar.
Yeah.
So the government wants to introduce measures that would make it easier for smaller or newer airlines to try and break up this duopoly. So this includes things like harsher penalties for airlines, which have been found to be acting anti-competitively. The government has also suggested reviewing its own travel policies to avoid giving airlines preferential treatment.
Interesting.
Yeah. We've also been hearing a bit about slot hoarding recently, and this is basically where major airlines book a number of arrival and departure slots at major popular airports, and then they try and maintain priority access to the runway through this method. But it's also considered anti-competitive, and what they've called it here is anti-competitive slot misuse.
Okay.
And this is a key thing that needs to be addressed to try and improve competition in the aviation industry.
Do they have any suggestions on how to actually improve that?
Some reform on slot hoarding was introduced recently at Sydney Airport, but the government's going to be looking at ways to make changes on how slots are regulated and how these regulations are enforced Australia-wide.
Okay, and so we got onto the topic of slot hoarding because we were talking about competition in Australia and that it's been very difficult, and we were speaking there of Rex, which is no longer flying between major capital cities, but it has survived in some form, and it is, there are still Rex services flying regionally. So was there anything to say in this white paper about regional aviation? Because I imagine that that's also another big issue. There are so many big issues in this.
Well, on the note of Rex, they're currently going through their voluntary administration process. And so this paper is sort of being released amidst all of that. The government says that it wants to support regional air services, but whether or not that means it's actually going to provide direct support to Rex isn't actually clear. The paper has called for the Productivity Commission to review regional airfares and also to look at ways to improve access to regional areas with domestic airlines. It also detailed a couple plans to upgrade regional and remote airports.
Okay, and just before we turn to what the opposition said, because I'm really interested to understand what's happened here, because it does feel above politics. Before we turn there, though, the white paper, I understand, also touched on climate.
Yes, there was a lot of stuff on reaching net zero because that's the goal that we have for 2050.
Yeah.
And that also includes reducing the carbon impacts that the aviation industry has, which produces about 2% of the world's energy-related CO2 emissions. The white paper is basically calling for more research and development into renewable energy sources for planes and aviation in general. They've included plans to make sustainable fuels, or what they're calling low-carbon liquid fuel, here in in Australia. The government is also looking at the potential for battery-operated aircrafts for domestic flights or short-term flights.
That is absolutely crazy. And I know it's the future, but it blows my mind completely. Okay, so I preempted it a bit before, but what have we heard from the opposition? We've spoken a lot about the role of the government in coming to the table with this white paper. What have we heard from the opposition?
The coalition has been critical of the white paper, saying it doesn't go far enough and broadly enough, and that the government has mishandled its approach to tackling issues across the aviation industry, particularly domestically. Shadow Transport Minister Bridget McKenzie told TDA that, quote, Australian airlines are not being held to the same standards as airlines overseas. Senator McKenzie said that the white paper includes 56 recommendations, but, quote, no specific measures to get planes running on time, to address the spiralling cost of airfares or address the delays and cancellations. We're heading into an election year, and the opposition has accused the government of delaying action on an aviation overhaul until after the election. McKenzie said the government has, quote, refused to engage on reforms and that the white paper is a missed opportunity.
I mean, just on that point, she said, Senator McKenzie there, that the government hasn't addressed cancellations, but we have spoken about the fact that that does feature quite prominently, but I'll leave that to the government to identify. What are the timeframes here? What happens from a white paper kind of being birthed to anything actually happening from there?
The white paper tells us what the government wants to legislate to overhaul aviation, but it doesn't mean that it can or will necessarily pass legislation across every single reform that's been put in.
Sounds like there's a lot.
Yeah. So the Transport Minister said the white paper is, generally speaking, a 20-year plan.
Wow.
In terms of what we can see action on, though, in the near future, slot reform seems to be on the priority list. As Transport Minister Catherine King said, that slot reform legislation is actually currently being drafted, and she said it's expected to reach Parliament shortly. King also said that an interim ombudsman will be appointed this week to start drafting the Charter of Consumer Rights, which we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
And the ombudsman will be able to receive complaints next year. And that's when King said we can expect more legislation to come through. But as I mentioned, we're getting close to the election, which is weird to think about. And many of these reforms are probably up in the air until then.
Were you just waiting the whole podcast to be able to say that? Love it. Thanks for coming onto the podcast, Nandini. I mean, a really interesting topic, and I think one where consumer rights and legislation and politics all kind of come into one. So lots to look at there and lots to keep an eye on. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Daily Aus. If you are listening on Spotify or Apple, or you are watching us on YouTube, please hit follow or subscribe. That's the way that the tech platforms know that you like what we do and keep serving it to you. We'll be back again tomorrow, but until then, have a fabulous Tuesday.